Leipzig. Napoleonic Wars, 1813. The Allied victory over Napoleon at Leipzig in 1813 marked the first significant cooperation among European nations against a common foe. As the largest armed clash in history up to that time, Leipzig led to the fall of Paris and the abdication of Napoleon. After the Russian army and winter had handed Napoleon a nasty defeat in 1812, Europeans felt confident that peace would prevail after more than a decade of warfare. They were wrong. As soon as Napoleon returned to France from icy Russia, he set about rebuilding his army, conscripting teens and young men. He strengthened these ranks of inexperienced youths with veterans brought back from the Spanish front. While Napoleon had been weakened by Russia, he believed that the other European countries were too distrustful of each other to ally against him. In early 1813, he decided to advance into the German provinces to resume his offense, just as he had done before. He planned to defeat each army he encountered and assimilate the survivors into his own force. European leaders were correct to fear that Napoleon could accomplish his objectives, but they remained reluctant to enter into alliances with neighbors who were former and possibly future enemies. Karl von Metternich, the foreign minister of Austria, saw that neither of his nor any other European country could stand alone against the French, even though he had previously negotiated an alliance with Napoleon. He now began to assemble a coalition of nations against the French emperor. Metternich's diplomacy, combined with the massing of the French army on the German border, finally convinced Prussia, Russia, Sweden, Great Britain, and several smaller countries to ally with Austria in March 1813. Napoleon disregarded the alliance and crossed into Germany with the intention of defeating each opposing army before the Allies could actually unite against him. Napoleon won several of the initial fights, even defeating the Prussians at Lutzen on May 2nd. He soon realized, however, that his new army was not the experienced one he had lost in Russia. More importantly, he had not been able to replace much of his cavalry lost in the Russian winter, limiting his reconnaissance and intelligence-gathering capabilities. When Napoleon learned that armies were marching towards Dresden from the north, south, and east against him, he negotiated a truce that began on June 4th. Metternich met with Napoleon in an attempt to reach a peace settlement, but despite generous terms that allowed France to retain its pre-war borders and for him to remain in power, Napoleon refused to accept the agreement. During the negotiations, both sides continued to add reinforcements. On August 16th, the truce ended and combat resumed. For 2 months, the Allies harassed the French, but avoided a pitched battle while they're solidifying their plans for a major attack. Napoleon's army, forced to live off the land and to rapidly march and countermarch against the multiple armies around them, steadily became more exhausted. In September, the Allies began a general offensive in which the French won several small battles. Yet the Allies forced them back to Leipzig in October. Napoleon had 175,000 men to defend the town, but the Allies massed 350,000 soldiers and 1,500 artillery pieces outside his lines. On the morning of October 16, 1813, Napoleon left part of his army in the north to resist an attack by the Prussians, while he attempted to break through the Russian and Austrian lines in the south. The battle raged all day as the front swept back and forth, but by nightfall both sides occupied the same positions as when the battle began. Little action took place on October 17th because both sides rested. The battle on October 18th closely resembled that of 2 days earlier. 9 hours of furious combat accomplished little except to convince Napoleon that he could not continue a battle of attrition against the larger Allied force. The odds against him increased when the Swedish army arrived to join the Allies, and a unit of Saxons deserted the French to join the other side. Napoleon attempted to establish another truce, but the Allies refused. During the night, the French began to withdraw westward by crossing the Elster River. A single stone bridge, which provided the only crossing, soon created a bottleneck. Napoleon deployed 30,000 soldiers to act as a rear guard to protect the crossing, but they were stranded when the bridge was destroyed. A few swam to safety, but most, including 3 senior officers, were killed or captured. Once again, Napoleon limped back towards Paris. Behind him, he left 60,000 dead, wounded, or captured French soldiers. The Allies had lost a similar number, but they could find replacements far more quickly and easily than Napoleon. Other countries, including the Netherlands and Bavaria, which Napoleon had added to his confederation by conquest, now abandoned him and joined the Allies. On December 21st, the Allies invaded France, and following their victory at Paris on March 30th, 1814, forced Napoleon into exile on Elba. Napoleon soon returned, but after only 100 days he suffered his final defeat by the Allies at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. Metternich continued his unification efforts and signed most of the Allies to the Concert of Europe, which provided a balance of power and a peace that lasted until the Crimean War in 1854. Most of the Allies survived another 3 decades until the ambitions of Germany brought an end to European peace. The Battle of Leipzig was important because it brought Napoleon a defeat from which he could not recover. More important, however, was the cooperation of armies against him. The alliance is so significant that Leipzig is frequently called the Battle of the Nations. For these reasons, Leipzig ranks as one of history's most influential battles. Leipzig also eclipses Waterloo in its influence. While the latter was certainly more decisive, a victory by Napoleon at Leipzig would likely have broken the alliance and placed the French in a position to once again defeat each of the other nations' armies. A French victory at Leipzig would have meant no defeat of Napoleon at Paris, no abdication to Elba, and no return to Waterloo. Waterloo, the Napoleonic Wars of 1815. The Allied victory over Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 brought an end to French domination of Europe and began a period of peace on the continent that lasted for nearly half a century. Waterloo forced Napoleon into exile, ended France's legacy of greatness, which it has never regained, etched its name on the list of history's best-known battles, and added a phrase to the vernacular: Waterloo has come to mean decisive and complete defeat. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, 20-year-old Napoleon left his junior officer position in the king's artillery to support the rebellion. He remained in the military after the revolution and rapidly advanced in rank to become a brigadier general 6 years later. Napoleon was instrumental in suppressing the royalist uprising in 1795, for which his reward was command of the French army in Italy. Over the next 4 years, Napoleon achieved victory after victory as his and France's influence spread across Europe and into North Africa. In late 1799, he returned to Paris where he joined an uprising against the ruling Directory. After a successful coup, Napoleon became the first consul and the country's de facto leader on November 8th. Napoleon backed up these aggrandizing moves with military might and political savvy. He established the Napoleonic Code, which assured individual rights of citizens, and instituted a rigid conscription system to build an even larger army. In 1800, Napoleon's army invaded Austria and negotiated a peace that expanded France's border to the Rhine River. The agreement brought a brief period of peace, but Napoleon's aggressive foreign policy and his army's offensive posturing led to war between France and Britain in 1803. Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France in 1804, and for the next 8 years achieved a succession of victories, each of which created an enemy. Downplaying the loss of much of his navy at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Napoleon claimed that control of Europe lay on the land, not the sea. In 1812, he invaded Russia and defeated its army only to lose the campaign to the harsh winter. He lost most of his army in the extended campaign on the Spanish Peninsula. In the spring of 1813, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden allied against France, while Napoleon rallied the survivors of his veteran army and added new recruits to meet the enemy coalition. Although he continued to lead his army brilliantly, the stronger coalition defeated him at Leipzig in October 1813, forcing Napoleon to withdraw to southern France. Finally, at the urging of his subordinates, Napoleon abdicated on April 1, 1814. And accepted banishment to the island of Elba near Corsica. Napoleon did not remain in an exile for long. Less than a year later, he escaped Elba and sailed to France, where for the next 100 days he struck a trail of terror across Europe and threatened once again to dominate the continent. King Louis XVIII, whom the coalition had returned to his throne, dispatched the French army to arrest the former emperor, but they instead rallied to his side. Louis fled the country, and Napoleon again claimed the French crown on March 20th. Veterans as well as new recruits swelled Napoleon's army to more than 250,000. News of Napoleon's return reached the coalition leaders while they were meeting in Vienna. On March 17th, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia agreed to each provide 150,000 soldiers to assemble in Belgium for an invasion of France to begin on July 1st. Other nations promised smaller support units. Napoleon learned of the coalition plan and marched north to destroy their army before it could organize. He sent part of his army, commanded by Emmanuel de Grouchy, to attack the Prussians under Gerhard von Blücher, in order to prevent their joining the Anglo-Dutch force near Brussels. Napoleon led the rest of the army against the British and the Dutch. The French army won several minor battles as they advanced into Belgium. Although the coalition commander, the Duke of Wellington, had little time to prepare, he began assembling his army 12 miles south of Brussels, just outside the village of Waterloo. There he arrayed his defenses on high ground at Mount St. Jean to meet the northward marching French. By the morning of June 18th, Napoleon had arrived at Mount St. Jean and deployed his army on high ground, only 1,300 yards from the enemy defenses. Napoleon's army of 70,000, including 15,000 cavalrymen and 246 artillery pieces, faced Wellington's allied force of about 65,000, including 12,000 cavalry and 156 guns, in a 3-mile line. Both commanders sent word to their other armies to rejoin the main force. A hard rain drenched the battlefield, causing Napoleon to delay his attack as late as possible. On June 18th, so that the boggy ground could dry and not impair his cavalry and artillery. After ordering a sustained artillery bombardment, Napoleon ordered a diversionary attack against the Allied right flank in the west in hopes of getting Wellington to commit his reserve. The British defenders on the west flank, including the Scots and Coldstream Guards, remained on the reserve slope of the ridge during the artillery bombardment, and then came forward when the French advanced. The attack against the Allied right flank failed to force Wellington to commit his reserve, but Napoleon pressed on with his main assault against the enemy center. As the attack progressed, Napoleon spotted the rising dust of Blücher's approaching army, which had eluded Grouchy's, closing on the battlefield. Napoleon, disdainful of British fighting ability and overly confident of his own leadership and the abilities of his men, continued the attack, in the belief that he could defeat Wellington before the Prussians joined the fight, or that Grouchy would arrive in time to support the assault. For 3 hours, the French and the British fought, often with bayonets. The French finally secured a commanding position at the center at La Haye-Sainte, but the Allied lines held. Late in the afternoon, Blücher arrived and seized the village of Plancenoit in Napoleon's rear, which forced the French to fall back. After a brutal battle decided by bayonets, the French forced the Prussians to withdraw. Napoleon then turned back against Wellington. Napoleon ordered his most experienced battalions forward from their reserve position for another assault against the Allied center. The attack almost breached the Allied defenses before Wellington committed his own reserves. When the survivors of Napoleon's best battalions began to withdraw from the fight, other units joined the retreat. The Prussians, who had regrouped, attacked the French flank, sending the remainder running in disorder to the south. Napoleon's last few reserve battalions led him to the rear, where he attempted without success to regroup his scattered army. Although defeated, the French refused to give up. When the Allies asked a French old guard officer to surrender, he replied, "The guard dies, it never surrenders." More than 26,000 French were killed or wounded, and another 9 captured at Waterloo. Allied casualties totaled 22,000. At the end of the one-day battle, more than 45,000 men lay dead or wounded within the 3-square-mile battlefield. Thousands more on both sides were killed or wounded in the campaign that led to Waterloo. Napoleon agreed once again to abdicate on June 22nd, and 2 years later, the Allies returned Louis to power. Napoleon and his 100 days were over. This time, the British took no chances. They imprisoned Napoleon on remote St. Helena Island in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. Even if Napoleon had somehow won the battle, he had too few friends and too many enemies to continue. He and his country were doomed before his return from Elba. France never recovered its greatness after Waterloo. It returned territory and resumed its pre-Napoleon borders. With Napoleon banished, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria maintained a balance of power that brought European peace for more than 4 decades. and usually long period, in a region where war was much more common than peace. While a period of peace in itself is enough to distinguish Waterloo as an influential battle, it and Napoleon had a much more important effect on world events. While the Allies fought to replace the King of France on his throne, their leaders and individual soldiers saw and appreciated the accomplishments of a country that respected individual rights and liberties. After Waterloo, as the common people demanded a say in their way of life and government, constitutional monarchies took the place of absolute rule. Although there was post-war economic depression in some areas, the general plight of the common French citizen improved in the post-war years. Through the passage of time, the name Waterloo has become synonymous with total defeat. Napoleon and France did indeed meet their Waterloo in southern Belgium in 1815, but while the battle brought an end to one age, it introduced another. Although the French lost, the spirit of their revolution and individual rights spread across Europe. No kingdom or country would again be the same.